Digital Jihad, The Rise of Anti-India Propaganda in E-Papers. Written by Nitin Sawant. Nearly a century ago, American philosopher Elbert Hubbard presciently articulated the role of the mainstream legacy media when he declared that an editor is a person employed by a newspaper, whose business it is to separate the wheat from the chaff and to see that the chaff is printed. Over these decades, all the chaff that got printed and later televised ensured that the legacy media was left scraping the bottom of the barrel regarding credibility. Indeed, imagine the belief paralysis when a survey revealed that 38% of Americans have no trust and confidence at all in newspapers, TV, and radio, while 28% of U.S. adults say they do not have very much confidence. 27% have a fair amount, with barely 7% of Americans confessing to having a great deal of trust and confidence in the media. Simply put, none of the hokum that lately gets printed is even worth the paper it is being printed upon. Naturally, we are witnessing a nosedive in legacy media subscriptions and ad revenues, with many long-standing media outlets getting snapped up by the freshly minted web billionaires looking to buoy up their image in the cocktail circuit with a few heritage trophy purchases. So, where does all the chaff go now to get printed? Well, it goes online. It has dawned upon the narrative peddlers that their chaff may not be fit to print on a piece of paper, but surely they can unveil reams of it on an e-paper and disseminate it far and wide. And thus were born the multitude of PDFs, carrying assorted propaganda that cannot be classified as news anymore, now rebranded as some country report, policy brief, reporting guide, think tank review, or online blog exposition that is issued by some freshly cobbled up strategy group or artist collectives or by a random for hire left liberal org looking for some media endowment to stay relevant. Yes, the chaff is fast spreading online like a rash, and it is exactly with this contextual frame of reference that we must analyze the latest stream of reports by various policy groups and media orgs that seek to deprecate, diabolize and demonize all the Hindus, Hindutva, India, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh RSS, Vishwa Hindu Parishad VHP, and the Hindu ecosystem at large. Report. It all began with the Savera report, a newly cobbled-up group of left liberal washouts belching and bellowing over the alarming rise of Hindu supremacy in the United States, primarily targeting the VHP of America, throwing in the whole kit and caboodle of deflated disinformation, tom-tomming it to be an interfaith, multiracial, and anti-caste effort. But once the report was debunked as hogwash and they couldn't get a single left-lib celeb to push its claims, the efforts were redoubled with new reports from peddlers who had seemingly better international credibility. So, in came the South Asia Scholar Activist Collective's Hindu Nationalism Reporting Guide, which was basically a poor ChatGPT rehash of the same Savera report, albeit with different fonts and a new template. Unsurprisingly, it got no better traction than the Savera report. The only noise it made was the kaching when it hit the recycle bins in the laptops of a few gullible who were fooled into downloading it. Naturally, an upgrade in the status of the issuing authority was sought, and in came the risk of mass atrocities in India policy brief by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Surely this report was on the ball, right? No. The formula of having non-Indian whitey-white names issuing homilies on secularism was potent, but how can you salvage a putrid piece of trash? None of these reports could move the needle in the Indian mainstream media space, as none of the Indian left liberals could accord any cogency to their perfidy. Likewise, their global PR fell flat despite Savera getting 100 similar like-minded orgs to endorse their effort. All they could muster was a puff piece by a brown sepoy, Richa Karmakar, in a vague religious news portal, Religious News Service, which opened up with a lament on how many Christians traveling to teach or preach in the country were turned around and thrown out of India. Somehow, that act of the Indian government makes them worthy of the hate report by Savera. It is not that the portal boasts any journalistic integrity, but surely, a simple Google search could have revealed how proselytizing is almost illegal in India unless it can be proven voluntary. Besides, anti-religious conversion laws are pretty strict in some states like Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, and Jharkhand. Some of these laws were enacted much before their pet-hate current government came into power. And, while the piece takes great pain to quote a few Indian Americans and highlight the 100 orgs supporting Savera, did the same portal ever manage to highlight how 80 other signatories from 10 countries, including the US, Canada, Israel, India, the UK, Austria, Australia, Netherlands, Russia, and South Africa have also issued a formal complaint to UN Human Rights Council made by an Indian American or Chingari over Sharia abuse of women? Or shall we conclude that only an anti-India voice gets their attention? Likewise, the policy brief issued by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum too falls flat, considering their authoritativeness on the subject looks heavily prejudiced with practically zero report on the U.S. and the recent wave of unchecked anti-Semitism in the American campuses, since the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas. Imagine the trustworthiness of a supposedly Jewish org that shies away from identifying the anti-Semitism happening right under its nose and yet has the audacity to advise on matters that it cannot comprehend, happening thousands of miles away. Although it was not just these few reports that chose to castigate India and Hindus, recently, there has been a barrage of anti-Hindu reportage in the form of opinion pieces, editorials, special reports, think tank research reports, etc. Here is a sampler of a few chosen ones that stood out for their malice and vitriol. Australian Institute of International Affairs. Australia's woeful response to rising authoritarianism in India. Bloomberg. Billionaire press barons are squeezing media freedom in India, and billionaire Raj is pushing India toward autocracy. Chatham House. UK. Democratic backsliding in India could prompt the West to review its cooperation with Delhi. Daily. Austin, Texas. India is the future of the authoritarian internet. Financial Times. UK. Indian democracy developed East Asian characteristics. Voters are increasingly willing to trade political freedom for economic progress. And the mother of democracy is not in good shape. Le Monde. France. India democracy in name only. Lowy Institute. Crushing dissent in a new paranoid India. Nippon. Japan. Indian democracy in peril. Slide into autocracy likely to continue. Reason Magazine. Authoritarianism is winning on every front in India. The Atlantic Magazine. What has happened to the rule of law in India? The Bullet Socialist Project. The tragedy of India's authoritarian descent. The New York Times. Modi's India is where global democracy dies. The Guardian. As India goes to the polls, can democracy deliver a better life for all of its people? And The Guardian view on India's election. Fixing a win by outlawing dissent damages democracy. Amongst all of these, Time magazine had an air of wretched finality in declaring, modification of India is almost complete, which sort of exposed its own 2019 pre-election piece of, can the world's largest democracy endure another 5 years of a Modi government? The pertinent question is how one cooks such acidic reportage with this regularity. What are the key ingredients? Reportage Manufacturing 101. To understand the latest flurry of anti-India and anti-Hindu drivel served by the left liberals, you have to study the recipe that has served them well for over a decade now. Journalist and media analyst Amol Parth has studied the irrational global media coverage of socio-political developments in India through facts and figures by analyzing over 3,000 reports from various international publications such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time Magazine, The Guardian, BBC, etc. His findings show that there is indeed a prejudice in reportage, and also a tendency of having exaggerated headlines with minimal substance in the story to support the doomsday prophecies in their headlines. Evidently, these publications have used the most negative and divisive words for their ridicule of India. In 500 headlines, it was found that the most used words were these 10: fear, hate, violence, riot, Hindu, Muslim, Kashmir, cow, mob, and protest. Imagine the paradox. India is currently the best performing economy in the world, yet all the viral headlines it gets don't have a single word on business. Now, most of the allegations mentioned in these hate reports have already been debunked piecemeal earlier, but it would help to check on a few terms that form the basis of their newfound hostility. While there is enough evidence to destroy their fulminations over the 2002 Gujarat riots, the Ram Mandir court case, etc., the reportage manufacturers have nowadays suddenly swerved and pushed forth fresh animus in the form of Savarkar jihad terminology, and, most importantly, Manipur, the Savarkar fixation. The Savarkar issue is particularly complex as they strive to debase, deride, and devalue one of the tallest leaders of India's freedom movement, making him look and sound like an anti-Islamist, villainizing him as the creator of the Hindutva theory of Indian nationhood, in sharp contrast with the pacifist secularist Nehruvian or Gandhian idea of India. And what exactly was the definition of Hindutva, according to Mr. Savarkar? Well, Evidently, he simply quoted Vishnu Purana that defined the people of the holy land of Bharadam, Uttaran Yatsa Mudrasya Himadriyachav Dakshina. Varshantad Partha Nam Parthi Yatra Santatiya, north of the ocean, south of the Himalayas, lies the land named Bharadam, populated by Bharat's descendants. In simple terms, every person born in this holy land, who holds this land sacred and has a cultural kinship with his fellow beings residing here are essentially the Bhartiya people or Indians. Expounding further, all the Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, and even Muslims who hold a sacred reverence to this land of Bharadam are the true inheritors of this land and should largely be thought of as Sanatanis. The only people who had problems with this all-encompassing definition of Hindutva by Savarkar were the Islamist leaders who could not coexist without Islamist dominance and who eventually carved out a separate homeland for Muslims in the form of Pakistan. Even today, Savarkar's definition of Hindutva or Indianness is a sore point amongst all divisive forces that aim to balkanize India, as adherence to Savarkar's values would eventually take Muslims away from the separatist forces and integrate them within the Vishnu Puran-infused spiritual Indianness, without the need of any religious conversion. So, it is natural that all these anti-India reports harp on Savarkar and heap abuses on his heritage for keeping India and Indians together. Love-Jihad. Another feature of their divisive reportage is their wholesale umbrage towards hyphenating every Islamist escapade with jihad. They take particular offense towards the term Love-Jihad, not knowing that the term was given to us by the former Kerala Chief Minister and Communist Party of India Marxist stalwart V.S. Akuthanandan, and not by any Hindu organization. The biggest proponent of the Love-Jihad theory happens to be the church in southern India, which has subsequently extended the hyphenated terminology further to drugs and land. Why? Even the Washington Post could not stop itself from branding the unchecked spread of Hamas grisly videos on social media as Video Jihad, the Manipur issue. However, the key addition to 2024's hostile reportage has been that of Manipur and the alleged plight of Christian minorities that have been used to rile up every churchgoer in the West. What exactly is the Manipur issue? The reality is that the genesis of this Manipur madness is almost 7 decades old, and it involves several conspiracy theories involving the CIA and the church. Although the last wave of Manipur violence started with an innocuous High Court decision in March 2023 that would have allowed the Hindu Meitei tribes to settle in the hill districts under the Land Reform Act, which has so far allowed exceptional privileges only to the Christian Naga and Kuki tribes. However, the violence shot up once the Indian government decided to fence their 400 kilometers long open border with Myanmar and stop the free movement regime that allowed the Christian Kukis to move freely between the two countries. The reason for the violence was simply the government's war on drugs. As it turns out, Manipur's proximity to the Golden Triangle of Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos, the biggest opium-producing area in the world, was problematic. The Indian government went into an overdrive, wherein drugs worth 60,000 rupees crores were seized, poppy plantations of over 20,000 hectares were destroyed, 2,461 people were arrested, and 3,066 cases were registered since 2022. Manipur's geographical proximity to the Golden Triangle made it a primary transit route for drug trafficking. It threatens to transform the state into a major poppy production and trafficking hub, says Manipur Chief Minister N. Biren Singh. So where do the CIA and the church come in? As it turns out, during the Cold War, the CIA wanted to stop communism's influence worldwide, and to do that, they needed copious amounts of money, and they decided to get that money by selling drugs. When the operation was made public, it became known as Operation Gladio. While several governments sought to play down its influence, every time a political assassination is attempted in Europe, the telltale signs of Operation Gladio are visible, the most recent being the attempt on the life of Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico. Paul L. Williams' seminal book, Operation Gladio. The unholy alliance between the Vatican, the CIA, and the Mafia illustrates the entire value system, although the part that is particularly interesting in Manipur's context is the role of the CIA and the church in the Golden Triangle area. Manipur's ethnic violence is believed to have been sparked by a plot by well-connected transnational drug traffickers to prevent the destruction of their poppy farms under the Manipur government's war on drugs campaign. Incidentally, the Indian government's campaign disrupts the business model of the Christian Kukis and the various church NGOs involved in this nasty business. Hence the disproportionate attention to Manipur's skirmish. To gauge the amount of insidious attention that Manipur and India get from the church's ecosystem, one has to compare it with Nigeria, where 62,000 Christians have been killed by the Boko Haram Islamists since 2000. Every 2 hours, a Nigerian Christian is killed for their faith. These facts entail that all eyes of the Christian ecosystem need to be on Nigeria, and yet all the atrocities that they can see, hear, and read are in Manipur. Indeed, India does not even feature in the top 10 countries that are alleged to have discriminated against Christians, and yet Manipur makes the most news. Recently, the European Union claimed that aid worth 250,000 euros, over 230,000 US dollars, was made for the state of Manipur via ADRA, Adventist Development and Relief Agency, which is supposedly a humanitarian agency operated by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, for the 1,500 most vulnerable families in Manipur, which suffered from hailstorms and heavy rain earlier this month. However, realizing that this aid via ADRA is purely for evangelical purposes, the government of Manipur has categorically refused to accept it. If you are wondering why there is so much international attention on Manipur, look no further than Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's comments regarding an alleged plot to create a Christian state like East Timor from parts of Bangladesh and Myanmar. Her comments were made without specifying the name of the country, although fingers were pointed towards the US and the CIA for their recent interference in the Bangladesh elections. Squadron leader, retired Sadrul Ahmed Khan, a member of the Awami League's Finance and Planning Affairs Subcommittee, openly pointed out that America's tacit backing of the Christian Kukichin Myanmar rebels has security implications for not only Bangladesh and Myanmar but also India, which also has a large population of the ethnic group in the northeastern states, such as Manipur. The unhinged media. If you peek deeper into the media's terribly biased reportage, you will see a clear pattern emerging. For starters, all these reports tend to ignore the hard data from the ground that shows India is getting more cohesive, with equitable distribution of benefits to the subaltern and lesser conflicts between communities. Then cometh the torrent of articles, op-eds, reports, and blogs using anecdotal or unverifiable counterfactual data that gives the world an impression of Indian democracy being in danger, the constitution being subverted, minorities getting displaced, etc. This faulty reportage is subsequently used to push separatist ideas like balkanization of the country, reverting to the old socialist mores where everyone is poor and dependent on social security for survival, etc. Once these ideas provoke a response from the administration, like cancellation of the visas of the anti-Indian elements, then use it as a proof of concept of the new India's intolerance towards its critics and peddle victimhood for greater effect. In essence, the modus operandi of this elitist gabfest works like a runaway circular sourcing, wherein the same set of motivated parties keep quoting each other till the entire confabulation looks like a piece of solid wisdom. If you go back and reread all the reports on India, Hindus, or Hindutva, you will indeed see the same lot generating a lot of noise based on each other's opinions and peddling it as a judgment against a democratically elected government. It also remains to be seen if the same discourse could continue had the Indian government taken the legal route against this avalanche of slandering. Can these media outlets and think tanks afford to take the same approach to reporting within America? Remember how Fox News had to pay Dominion Voting Systems nearly $800 million to avert a trial in the voting machine company's lawsuit that would have exposed how the network promoted lies about the 2020 presidential election. Imagine India doing the same with these election influencers. Won't Bloomberg go crying to the world if it is held responsible and penalized for its baseless reporting of India's voting machines are raising too many questions? The fact is that most reports are not even fact-checked enough to see if their bluster passes reality muster. Imagine the travesty when a supposedly reputed institution like the London School of Economics put out a report featuring a map that shows Jammu Kashmir in India as a Christian-dominated state. When fact-checked, it cunningly responded without taking any responsibility for its silly errors. All said, none of the reports mention the fact that the Indian government invited representatives from 25 different nations to observe its ongoing 2024 general elections and witness the dance of democracy firsthand. Truly, it takes a thick-headed journo to push a narrative of elections in India being hijacked when the world is watching it from up close. The endgame. One must wonder why the Western media outlets are so invested in the Indian elections, vainly trying to influence its outcome. Amol Parth's analysis indicates a strong correlation between their digital readership growth in India and their sensational reportage. Their readership in India has grown more rapidly than their growth globally. Between March 2019 and March 2021, the New York Times witnessed a 22% rise in the Indian market. Similarly, the Wall Street Journal also grew in India twice as fast as it did globally. In March 2021, India's share of WSJ's growth grew to 2.6%, up from 1.99% in March 2019. The same is the case with Time magazine. The report also found that between March 2019 and March 2021, BBC grew by 173% in India, almost 5 times its global growth of 35%. One needs to check if the entire Muslim victimhood narrative peddling exercise is an attempt to sabotage India's good relationship with various Islamic emirates in the Middle East. Qatar has 6,000 Indian companies operating, with 700,000 Indians in their total population of 2.7 million. Kuwait has around 1 million Indians out of its total population of 4.7 million, while Saudi has 745 Indian companies and nearly 2.2 million Indians. Besides, 3.4 million Indians work in the UAE and Indian companies have invested $85 billion there. Most importantly, all these countries depend on India for their wheat, rice, and fresh produce for about 50% of their requirement. Can such awkward reportage put these many lives and livelihoods at risk? Actually, the Islamic world has paid the least attention to all such paid propaganda and has gone the whole hog to honor Indian PM Modi, bestowing him with their top accolades. Indeed, out of the 13 highest civilian awards bestowed on PM Modi, 6 have been from staunch Islamic countries, ranging from Saudi Arabia to Palestine. Even Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad has appreciated Indian support for his country amidst the decade-long crisis it has been facing. Mekdad said, at a time humanity doesn't mean anything for Western power, we found all human noble concepts prevailing in Indian foreign policy. It's not only Syria but any country suffering. However, what this negative reporting has indeed accomplished is that it has attached negative connotations to Hindutva within the American campuses, making life difficult for Indian students. By stretching the same oppressor-oppressed matrix into the Hindu narrative, these divisive forces are trying to equate Hindutva with Zionism, as is the case with UC Davis, painting a target behind the heads of all Indian Americans. Will this ploy work? Only time will tell. It goes without saying that the American voters do not like it when the shoe is on the other foot. The interference of other nations in their poll processes seriously riles up most upstanding American citizens, and rightly so. Take the case of Americans for Public Trust, which is battling Swiss billionaire Hans-Georg Weiss's blatant attempts to influence American elections with his cash of $243 million, which he has funneled to the dark money group 1630 Fund, investing nearly $100 million to fund ballot issue campaigns across 25 states over the last decade. And why is Weiss even interested in ballot measures? In his own words, he wants to interpret the American Constitution in the light of progressive politics. Too bad. None of the American media outlets are sensitive to the time bomb ticking right under their noses while proactively spreading canards about Indian democracy with their senseless reportage that is nothing more than incomprehensible verbiage of meaningless proportions. But then, as Oscar Wilde once said, to be intelligible is to be found out.